Hello, and welcome to this app, which will guide you through the process of using 6 tools that I have developed to help prevent the recurrence of psychosis. And I frame those 6 tools in a model of the mind. And I call this forward thinking, primarily because when we understand how the mind works, it is predictive. So any stimulus that we receive, we fast forward to assess the implications. And it's those implications that typically get our attention. So our brain is constantly passing information forwards to assess implications. And of course, that's one of the issues in the experience of hearing voices and extreme states or psychosis, whatever your preferred term is. So I want to show you that extreme states can actually be prevented. You're unlikely to have got here before you experience them, but I'll show you that you can prevent the recurrence of them. And what I want to do is just give you a couple of references from here, from people that I have worked with, to give you an idea of what people say. So this is someone who listened to me at a seminar, who said, I have to say my results have been awesome since your talk. I applied what you talked about, and now I only hear one voice, and I can ignore it pretty well. It's been great. I have so much more energy and time to do the things that I want. And that's the objective of learning to apply these tools and make them a habit, is that it'll make a difference in your life. And really what the tools are designed to do is to help you take control of the experience in the mind. This app will show you how to do that. When you have control of the experience in your mind, you project that into your life. So it gives you much more control of the story of your life that you're actually trying to create. This is someone else who also hears voices. He said, thank you so much. After you left, the voices remained very quiet. I could trigger a loud event by listening for them, and I learned to stay away from that curiosity. What an amazing development. And he went on to say that he got something that he'd never got from any therapist. So a couple of things in here. The one thing is the idea of making voices less intrusive, this sort of quietening of them. The other is avoiding the sort of curiosity of them, because actually a lot of the experience is actually about asking questions about them, and because they're so confusing, the questions we ask lead to all kinds of beliefs that shape the experience of voices. So what we want to do is, minimize, that process as much as we can. And the other thing about this is to say that this is actually not really, it's not a form of therapy. This is actually helping you gain control of your mind, understand your mind, understand the levers you can pull, and use that to create better experiences in the mind, which create better opportunities and outcomes in life. And I'll show you that you can do this by analyzing the situation more than you're analyzing the person. You may have some particular issues you want to deal with. And of course, I will actually show you one of the tools is about minimizing the sensitivities that we have developed through the experience. This last reference is actually from a mental health professional, someone who is a social worker actually, who is also a clinical psychologist, who said she had spent most of her life working with people who experience psychotic phenomena, and she wishes that she'd had the insight at the beginning of her career, because that would have changed her how she approached her practice. And the key point to get out of this is that actually just understanding the experience in the mind gets you halfway there, because when you understand what's happening, when you understand how your automatic reaction and response works to these unusual stimuli, it gives you a much better idea of the things that you can focus on to change the experience. So what this welcome and introduction video will cover is that it will talk about working with the mind, and what I describe, and I'm going to focus on the information flow in the mind. So really what happens, and you'll see this in all the educational videos that I'll refer to several times. So this I'll repeat this many times in the videos in this app, is we receive stimuli or inputs in a particular context, the context that we happen to be in or that we've chosen to be in. And that context is what creates our expectation. We're not typically aware of those. These are our kind of filters that we develop over time. Of course, once you recognize that they're there, you can become aware of them and you can choose them more deliberately. But in the absence of that, the brain does this kind of stuff automatically. So we have expectations of pretty much any situation. And of course, when stimuli arrive, we're comparing them to what we expected. And it is that comparison between these two states of information, what we expected and what's arriving, that creates an initial reaction. The reaction brings specific things into our attention, and that's from this fast forward to assessing the implications, you know, in life and for others out there. That then raises a whole lot of questions that shape our response. And this response is a question and answer session where we're simply exchanging information in the perception, between the perception and the outcome that we think is likely or that we're trying to achieve. And of course, it's the outcomes that have meaning in our life. This is where we give significance to them. And the key point I'm trying to show here with this arrow is that as we move from left to right in this process, the significance of the information grows, because this is our process of adding value to it or making it meaningful, you know, or gaining benefit from it. You know, so we get this kind of hockey stick effect where, you know, if we're finding a problem over here, at the outcome end, you know, it produces a much stronger reaction than over here, you know, at the stimulus end. And what you need to recognize is that this upfront piece is largely automatic. It's set by the brain by default. It doesn't mean we can't actually access it and change it. And of course, it's after the reaction. If the reaction is the piece that gets our attention. So the emotion in our reaction focuses our attention in a particular way. And that is also this kind of forward thinking. It points us in a direction. So if it's a threat, for example, you know, we tend to actually reverse the flow and have another look at the stimulus and keep our eye on it until we are able to create a context in which it's no longer a threat. You know, if it's something that we're actually interested in and we like, you know, we would move towards it. So our drive system would engage and we would, you know, act to move towards it. If it's something that we don't like, we would act to move away from it or change it. So that reaction is actually pointing our forward thinking in a particular direction. And you might want to think of it as our brain prefetching suggestions and saying, based on this initial fast forward that produces a reaction, these are the things that are likely to be relevant. And that's what comes into your aware mind. So what I want you to do is to show you that when you recognize this process, it gives you a different way of understanding voices. And it, you know, as you learn to manipulate this flow by manipulating the information, you will gain control of your experience. And you do that by working with the mind. And this is a key point, is whilst you can analyze the information flow, your response to it, your reaction to it, the emotional response to it is automatic. Okay, you can influence that over time when you understand how your programs work, but at any point in time, the emotional reaction is automatic. So the lever that you have to work with is in fact the information. And when we go into problem solving mode, all we're doing is we're slowing this process down and we're being more deliberate about it. You know, and we then kind of say, let's assess the situation. So where are we at? And in this series of videos, I'm going to do how I'm going to apply this idea is to actually look at our history of this phenomenon very, very briefly, and our experience, and give you a couple of ideas about how our emotional systems are reacting to it and responding to it. And then I'm going to point out why it's complicated, or what it is that makes it complicated, this experience, and then kind of show you, you know, how that points us to particular kinds of simplification. When you understand what's making it complicated and you simplify it, it enables you to pose a different question. So that we take the format then that shapes the response. You know, the question we ask shapes the response and the outcome that we achieve. And we can do this deliberately. So our mind is typically doing it automatically, but we can slow it down and do it deliberately. And of course, when we ask different questions, we'll come up with different answers. And I'll show you there, of course, how the 6 tools actually address you know, the experience and the complications that it creates, and that we can actually learn to do this much more rigorously simply by understanding this process, which is just this kind of situation, complication, question, answer, which is language that comes from a woman by the name of Barbara Minto, by the way. She's written a couple of books on this, which is really the shape of stories. And really what this is saying is the situation is this comparison of expectation and stimulus that produces a reaction. The complication is the thing that gets in the way of finding a good response. And we can cut our way through that by asking different questions, by simply changing the paradigm or the lens through which we actually look at the problem. And of course, as you ask different questions, you understand it differently. And that's, that's kind of one way, that's sort of one way to break through it. And just to give you a quick glimpse, to have a look at these sort of comments from voices, just to help you understand how they fast forward in this process. So when voices are saying to me, for example, Greggy boy, sit down and turn on the TV, the implications of that, the fast forward, is that who on earth are these voices to be telling me what to do? I'm at home doing my own thing. Why on earth should I have to consider and account for and take account of, allow for or appease voices in terms of what it is they want to do, and they're claiming. So when they say, Greggy boy, you can't swear on the web, on the web is the space in which we interact. It's a name that they've introduced. So they've introduced this whole other world, and then they're setting the rules in my mind. And of course, I object to that quite strongly. Who are voices to set the rules? And of course, where people kind of say to you, well, what do voices say? These are the kinds of things we say to them, but actually, it's pretty meaningless. What they say has implications, and those implications of this boost in significance, in our perception of what that actually means for us in the future. Because if voices are persisting and this carries on, this kind of stuff becomes very irritating, because I'm going to do whatever the hell I decide I want to do, not what voices tell me to do. And I'm certainly not going to let voices set the rules, for how I think. And I'm certainly not going to accept threats from them when they say, just you wait, Greggy boy. This is usually done in a kind of threatening tone. And when they say, let me help you with, they're implying that they can help me achieve particular outcomes. And of course, as soon as I allow that, then of course they can also work against me. So we don't understand. We have to understand the implications of each of these little comments, and each comment is a stimulus. It's a provocation that engages this process, and we assess the implications. And those implications are at this end where they're much, much more significant than the comment appears to be. And that's the point about these things. This is how voices create extreme states, because really, when you say to someone, this is what my voices are saying, it seems kind of pretty much inane. But actually, when voices are persisting and they're making these comments all the time and in many different formats, it really becomes annoying. And of course, your brain is automatically fast forwarding this information to assess the implications. And of course, that's the process that we want to get hold of and interrupt and disrupt. So just to have a quick look at the history and the big picture, the situation of this thing that we're calling hearing voices and extreme states. We have a very long history with it. You could see it going way back, even into paintings in cave dwellings. You certainly see a lot of it in the revealed religions. So thousands of years ago, the experience actually produced the revealed religions. And of course, there's all these kind of evolving ideas of what it is and what it means for us. And even today, we have a wide variety of professional opinions, beliefs, hypotheses. We have a wide variety of cultural interpretations that give it meaning in our cultures. And we have a wide variety of interpretations from peers. So people who experience voices. And this is because all of us are assessing it at the kick in the hockey stick end of that process, where we have the most variety in our experiences and frames of reference in which we're actually interpreting it. And it's in part because of that, this has been a particularly intractable and pretty wicked problem. the overwhelming evidence is that it destroys the quality of life. So no matter what you think, whatever your hypothesis is for what causes it is kind of secondary. The outcome is that it actually destroys the quality of life. It affects about 4% of the population, which affects their family and friends who don't know how to deal with it. And of course, the person who's experiencing this, their ability to earn their own income and make a living is often impaired, and they often, in fact, are told that. So of course, that creates all kinds of problems within families. Society has particular interpretations of it, which tend to be rosy. We kind of tend to believe in, especially when you put this thing into sort of cultural and spiritual world, people tend to believe it's all good, yet we're experiencing this thing as absolutely awful and cruel, and that creates this conflict. And then, of course, as I say, there's a whole group of professionals working in the space, from psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, social workers, peer specialists, a whole group of mental health professionals who are all kind of struggling with this experience. And what I want to do is kind of just summarize here and say that actually the way to simplify all of this is simply to say we do not know the cause of voices. There are probably hundreds of theories, and none of them stick, there isn't one that sticks out above the others. That kind of says this is the one that actually makes sense. So people kind of gravitate to one that makes sense to them, but there isn't one, certainly isn't one that emerges as making sense. So I'm simply saying we can acknowledge that this thing exists, and I'm saying we can observe it and we can model how it behaves. And when we do that, we can actually own how we react and respond to it. And doing that gives you control of the experience. You can knock off the extremes. And of course, when you do that, when you create better experiences, those emotions project into your life, and you have more control of your life. So what's it like in the detail? So the experience of this thing that we're calling hearing voices and extreme states, I like that linkage, because the hearing voices causes the extreme states, certainly. The sort of more medical term is psychosis, or you may have a specific diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar or schizoaffective disorder, or in fact, these techniques will also work for OCD, other disturbances of the process flow. And even if you call it a gift, or you live in a culture that values the experience as having meaning for the whole tribe, all of these things are, in the experience of it, scary and confusing and complicated. And what I'm doing here is describing this in terms of our three emotional systems. Our three emotional systems map to the three parts of our brain: the reptilian brain, the limbic system, and the frontal cortex. So that the reptilian brain is the kind of monitoring system. It's looking for patterns. So this thing is scary because it raises the alarms on all of our filters, which are kind of checking for patterns and managing by exception. So it keeps sneaking through, and it's coming through as an exception. In other words, a problem, therefore gaining attention, and therefore engaging our stealing mindshare and engaging our sort of processor. And so whilst the processor is then engaged in trying to find a solution to the problem or conflict that it has presented, it's very confusing, as you can see from the previous page. We can't even agree what it is, let alone what causes it. So beliefs and perceptions actually rule, and that's very, very confusing to find your way through. And of course, that makes it very, very complicated to find a good outcome. And of course, good outcomes are what soothes us. So in that flow from stimulus through to outcome, if we see a progression that adds value, sort of makes life better, creates a good experience, brings reward, I mean, those are the things that we're actually used to. And of course, we typically work through our life to make that easy. I mean, that's really what our automated brain is actually doing. It's creating these patterns for us where that's easy. I just call that flow when it works well, when the dots connect. Of course, what this thing is doing, because it's interfering with that process, is making very, very complicated. And our soothe system is not satisfied. And what that means is we're truncating the process. We're going round and round in circles, spending more time on our drive, trying to analyze this situation. We're focusing on the scary part. We're focusing on the stimuli more, trying to make sense of them, trying to make them coherent. Because until we do that, we actually don't fully understand the implications in the world. And of course, that's just churn. That's absolutely waste in the experience, and it's unpleasant because the brain is constantly assessing those implications, and that's what's producing the emotions and of course and the extremes. And those extreme states in the mind project into life, and of course life becomes scary, confusing, and complicated. And the thing is, we're all looking at it over here, whereas actually we can get closer to the root cause by coming way up here and dealing with this scariness that's getting our attention in a very systematic way, and then you'll find that the rest of the process actually will write itself. And that's really what this app is designed to help you do. So I'm going to talk about each of those, the scary, confusing, and complicated, to kind of show you why it is and how to look at it slightly differently, simply by understanding the processes in the mind. And part of our problem is actually that we don't get taught much about the mind. So we see the mind as a sort of black box. Really, what we typically notice are the inputs, so the stimuli that we get, and the outputs or the outcomes that we achieve. And we don't really have much of a clear idea of how this kind of works. And that's simply because it's an automated system. It's trained itself through our experience and through learning. And in fact, the only reason I have a good understanding of how this works is that I did a course in neuro-linguistic programming, which actually models the mind and talks about how language models the mind. And then this experience of voices brought even more attention to the mind. And of course, I focused on it. I focused on the weird characteristics of the stimuli. I asked myself, why am I reacting and responding the way that I am? And I asked myself, how is this actually affecting my outcomes, or how am I letting it affect my outcomes? Is really what it boiled down to. So, so what makes it scary is that we feel we don't have control, because we're assessing the implications over here. The stimulus is just arriving, and we're assessing the implications over here in our story. And our story I represent in this model, or say where there are 5 themes across the top here. It's me and my concept of self, my people, the people I interact with, my relationships, which is where I get social reward from, which is the most powerful reward system in the mind, in the body. My day, so this is my activity, what I'm doing, which I also represent down here, because activity typically most often involves some sort of physical activity. So it's how we're choosing where we are, our context, and of course our environmental stimuli are largely dominated by our activity. Of course, my activity is usually designed to create a fun now, so enjoying these things, and of course a better future for myself. And then, of course, if my future has benefit for our future, again, I'm getting a kind of stronger reward. So those are the basic components of my story or my world. This is just the middle bar is the mind. It's this process here. A new stimulus arrives. This window is the aware mind. When a stimulus arrives from my activity, it connects with my history, my information, my memories, and my memes or my programs. That's what engages the process. My mind selects from that bits of information, for me to focus on. And of course, from that, I project it forwards, this forward thinking. And from that, of course, I plan activity into my, later in the day, tomorrow, the next day, next week, or whatever. And of course, this is where we're evaluating this whole kind of process. And I say this is where we're most variable. But I say you can simplify it by looking, of course, at the stories. These inputs are strange, and I represent them by this jack in the box. And it feels like there's something winding this handle at the other end that's provoking you all the time. And what it's doing is it's producing these stimuli in the aware mind. So independent of my activity, these things are competing with my ordinary everyday stimuli. So they're in the aware mind and getting my attention anyway. And then because they're unusual and they come with intent, of course, we're giving them significance. And as you'll see in some of the other educational videos, that's just our mind reacting to a stimulus. When we learn not to interpret it in the frame of reference that voices present, and kind of say, not that, I'm going to interpret in this frame of reference, we're able to change that end of the hockey stick, of course, quite dramatically. So it's in the aware mind, and we experience it as this, either as a voice at a distance, observing what we're doing, or in most cases, this idea of what we're calling a thought echo, where I hear voices and my own thinking in the same space as two halves of a conversation. And of course, we experience that as interfering in some way, and it's either discouraging, so it's kind of pushing the process backwards and kind of saying, it's diminishing this end, or saying it won't happen, or it won't happen the way that you think it will. Of course, what that makes you do is go back to looking for the evidence, which is coming from here. This is the new piece of information that's engaging the process. And of course, as it discourages, of course, quite naturally, we associate problems with it, and we blame voices for it quite reasonably. The flip side is that it sometimes encourages, and it says, oh, something marvelous over here is going to happen, and let me help you with, or this man is going to, or I say if it's discouraging, sit down and turn on the TV. When it's working well and it seems to work in our favor, we're inclined to attribute outcomes to the voices, to this phenomenon. And the risk in that is that all that voices have to do is suddenly start discouraging you on the same theme. And what's happened is, when they were encouraging you, they raised your expectations. And then as soon as they start discouraging you, they're pushing that the other way. And that great expectation is actually not going to be achieved. And you get this big gap between what you think is going to happen and what you expected to happen or hoped would happen. And of course, that's what's causing the extremes. It's this exaggerated difference between perceptions and expectations that produces the strongest reaction in the body. But in terms of simplifying this thing, it's two most common ways of disturbing the system are this encouraging and discouraging. So it's arrives in the mind, it's in focus, and then it's encouraging, which raises our expectations, or it discourages, which diminishes our expectations. And of course, we experience it as interfering. And of course, we then ask the question, if it's interfering, what does it mean? And we then start to interpret it as having influence in the world around us. And of course, that's what's creating the extremes in perception. And what I want you to do on the story is actually just to focus on 4 points, and I'll repeat this several times. The one is this point at which I start to act with others in the world that I live in. So I call this my point of confidence. So this is my net view of myself and my self-image. It's the point from which I act to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. So if I feel good about myself, if I feel confident, if I feel optimistic, I have a much, much better chance of success in achieving the outcomes, of course, that I'm actually looking for. And then the other point is to focus on your outcomes as kind of story. How are your outcomes helping you achieve a better future? And the reason I'm targeting it over there is that it's when it affects our future that it has the biggest impact, because that's the long-term expectation. So and of course we're happy to invest to achieve that. So we might do something that we don't really enjoy right now, but we do it to achieve something that's fun later on. And of course, so we connect those dots of the steps to get there, even though some of them are not fun. The big picture is fun, and of course that's our reward progression. So these are the 2 points that are kind of most important. It's how I see myself, how I see my opportunities in the world, so how I can actually mediate and navigate my way through the world, dealing with others, and navigate my way towards what I'm trying to achieve for me. This one still, what's in the aware mind. And then the fourth one is my activity. So this is my whole day that I've represented here. Of course, my activity is what's producing new stimuli. It's actually where I'm experiencing reward. Okay, so this is where I'm engaging with other people, and am actually experiencing social reward. So we can make this thing a whole lot scary by recognizing that actually we can simplify our understanding in the story by just focusing on key points, and we can actually manage our perception of each of these to manage the end of the hockey stick. And then later on, I'll show you how we do that by actually getting a better understanding of this process, so that we can control its reaction to this thing. And then later on, I'll show you how we get to manage this thing as well, so that we can actually calm the whole, calm the whole process. So we can simplify that black box by looking at the basics of how information produces emotion. I call this info motion, because as the information flows, so flows emotion in line with it. And I say it's this comparison of two states of information: what I expect and what I'm seeing. So my perception versus over expectation. If my perception is better than expected, that comparison produces a positive result, which is good energy. If it's less than I expected, it's producing a negative result, which is bad energy, if you like, or less good energy. I mean, there's actually chemistry underpinning each of those. Of course, they make you feel differently. And of course, what you're trying to do, of course, is get that balance right, so that you actually typically are achieving better than you expected, because that's what makes you feel good and optimistic. And of course, that's what you want to get to. So understanding the process, the flow of information, is as simple as understanding these 5 boxes. An expectation is something we kind of typically have by default. We can set it more specifically. Stimuli typically arrive from our environment, with voices that come from this jack-in-the-box as well. They produce a reaction, and this is a physical reaction. We can't actually stop this. We don't want to, but what we can do is we can change how we react. And we can do this very, very deliberately and very, very strategically. And of course, what this is doing is it's bringing particular information into focus. So what you want to do is replace it, is interrupt that and replace it, and bring different information into focus to manage your response, to kind of say, what outcome am I actually trying to achieve? And instead of just accepting the fast forward flash of implications, you can actually just slow the process down and say, well, what outcome am I trying to achieve? And if that's what I'm trying to achieve, is this information then relevant? Because the reaction is based on pretty much an automated expectation. But actually, if you evaluate it over here in a deliberate way, you can actually decide whether or not it's useful or relevant. So you can just shift your frame of reference to the outcome side deliberately rather than automatically. Okay? And that's the point, is you're doing it deliberately, you're in control of it. You can choose different frames of references and decide which one, of course, actually suits you the best. And then just to recognize how your emotions are actually regulating this process. So what your emotions are doing is they're passing the information along from one step in the process to another. And they're doing this simply by, and I mentioned there are 3 emotional systems: our monitoring system, our drive system, and our soothe system. So our monitoring system is monitoring patterns. So this is, these are my filters that represent my expectations. And of course, what the monitoring system is designed to do is to manage by exception. So if something is fitting the pattern, it's saying let the process run through, of course, to implications. And if it's raising flags in my patterns, so I perceive it as a threat, or not what I expected, or less than I expected, of course, then my monitoring system will raise it as a flag and bringing it into to my attention, so that I can actually decide what to do with it. And of course, that's something that we've also automated. We've typically created programs for most of those things. But again, once we recognize that, we can actually just slow the process down, interrupt it, and actually take control of it very, very, very deliberately. So, the drive system then is the system that actually is modeling. It's holding these 2 systems, in our mind, this is our frontal cortex actually, and the soothe system is saying, these are the outcomes that I can achieve. Are they soothing? And if not, what can I do to make them soothing? Soothing being suits me, matches my preference, is in line with what I'm trying to achieve, matches my expectations, will satisfy others, all the things that produce reward, good outcomes. And it's then looking, of course, at the stimuli that's arriving from the body, and moving up through this kind of system to saying, yes, it's safe, trying to act on it. So the drive system is trying to find a way to achieve a desirable outcome. And of course, the soothe system is satisfied once we achieve a desirable outcome. Or we can simply map it and say, this is what a good outcome looks like. That's something I like, that's something I'm going to work towards. And of course, there may then, of course, be actions over a period of time to achieve it. At least you understand the steps, of course, to get there. And that's the progression that sort of builds reward in time. So what the monitoring system doing is it's defining the kind of objects in our stimuli. This is just a simple way to help you think through your emotions very simply. What are these 3 steps in my emotions? Where is it that my emotion is feeling strongest? So the monitoring system is identifying objects and patterns. It's looking for consistency. If it's consistent with history or what I'm trying to achieve, it'll let it flow, pass through the filters. If it's not consistent, or if it's an exception, a mismatch, or not what I expected, of course, then the filters will raise that conflict, into the aware mind, the drive system, and say, and prompt a question with leading information and prefetching information, which are, sort of first pass avenues that might actually yield an answer. And of course, that's the stuff that's typically happening very quickly. But when you slow it down, of course, you can actually be more selective about the path that you follow. And of course, that's what the drive system is trying to do. It's kind of trying to make sense of this information in the context of what you're trying to achieve, rather than just in the context in which it arrived. And of course, what we're looking for is coherent. Do I have the whole picture? Is it coherent? Am I missing pieces? Because if I'm missing pieces, my chances of making the right choice are lower. So of course, this is where we make the trade-off between investing in getting more information or accepting the information that we have. So do we go on an evidence search or information search, or do we work with what we have? And of course, this is where our beliefs and ideas and preferences sort of come into play. And of course, but when you slow down, you can actually identify all those things, but recognize that a lot of the time, of course, that's happening very quickly. And our soothe system is looking at outcomes and saying, are they acceptable? And of course, it's what I'm saying, is we look for congruence. In other words, does it fit my principles? And I'm using the word principles rather than values, because actually principles are what bridge different values between my values and your values. Principles are ideas that will satisfy all of us, satisfy both of our values. So it's typically doing the right thing, doing it right, being kind. And of course, so those are the kind of principles that satisfy each of our emotional systems. So of course, we're looking for congruence. And of course, the information flows. So if you imagine the stimulus arriving, through the body, the brain stem into the reptilian brain, which is the base of the brain. The first assessment is it safe? And of course, this is what is producing the fight, flight, or freeze response. Of course, if we see it as not safe, our first reaction is to run away, unless we know how to respond or are confident in our ability to respond, in which case we might fight. And of course, if we don't see an avenue for either of those, we tend to freeze, on the basis that doing nothing might be better than doing something that you don't know is of any use. And if you can imagine, if it's safe, then the brain says, okay, let's proceed to the next step, which is kind of saying, can I, is this safe to act on? Can I act on it? How should I act on it? This is where we're actually asking the question that starts to shape our response. And, of course, our drive system then engages with that question and tries to answer it in terms of trying to achieve an outcome. And our soothe system, is satisfied once we found an outcome that we think is actually congruent, in other words, something that I can act on, that I know will actually achieve appreciation and or reward. So again, just think of these 4 points in our emotional systems. These are the 4 points in our experience in the mind, and they map to the same 4 points in our story that I mentioned on the previous slide, and I'll repeat that and show you again. And of course, this is the way to kind of simplify the black box. It's this flow of information that is regulated by our emotions. And of course, we think of emotions as very complex. We struggle to kind of pinpoint them. The easiest way to pinpoint them is to think of them in terms of our three systems. First, our monitoring system, which is looking for patterns and manages by exception. What we're driving towards is an outcome that satisfies me and the world I live in. That's the congruence. Me and my world, or the world I'm in, are in alignment, at least at the kind of principle level. And if that's true, then that's the thing I will act on. And of course, drive system is exploring all those options and picking one based on an investment return kind of model. So usually, if you analyze your information, you can kind of say, well, where am I in the process? And which system is it that's bothering me? And you'll see that actually each of these systems will produce different types of information, and we'll understand that more later on. And of course, those emotions are just energy in motion, and that energy flows along with the information flow. And the important thing here is that this is all automatic, but when you understand how that's working and how it's regulating this system, you can actually influence it simply by regulating the information, by taking control of the flow of information. And instead of letting it fast forward, you can simply pause it. You can hit interrupt and say, how would I like to treat this? And I'll show you, of course, how to do that with voices, because you want to make it a habit. And of course, habits are actually just sort of programs or shortcuts that the mind creates, because of course, slowing this down all the time, of course, means you're using more time to solve problems, and less, you have less time having fun. And of course, what the shortcuts do is they accelerate the process from here to here. So from monitor to source system. So if it matches a pattern, it's likely, based on history, to achieve a good outcome. So we fast forward it. And of course, what you're doing is interrupting that fast forward and saying, I want the drive system to become involved. And you create a new pattern in your reaction and response to voices. And of course, you then create a new sort of fast forward. And I'll show you, of course, how the tools help you do that. So you're going to learn to use your predictive shortcuts, your beliefs, your preferences, and your programs, which also, as I say, regulated by emotions by exception, typically, is these things. You can interrupt all of these and bring them into focus and into your aware mind simply by identifying a point in this process at which you can spot them. And once you do that, you can then address the program and change it, address the belief and change it, address your preference, change it, if if in any way, of course, that you choose to. So that's the basics of what's in the black box. I'm sure anybody can remember the kind of 5 steps in the information flow, and we'll be repeating this kind of often. The 3 emotional systems, and if you like, the 4 steps along here that then map to the 4 points on the story. And those are the points that you're going to manage with these tools that this app will actually teach you to use. So we're still talking the situation here. We've done scary, and we've simplified the scariness by saying we can actually understand the process and manage it. It's confusing because there are so many opinions and beliefs and hypotheses out there. And in fact, what I'm reminding you of is that we do not know what causes voices. Unfortunately, there's some sloppy thinking, some sloppy science, some sloppy research, where we often confuse correlation with causality. And what we need to remember is that the mind is a system. I'm describing it as a process, as a way to simplify that system. But it's really a system with multiple components all interacting at the same time. I describe them as sequential. But in fact, of course, you can change the sequence, and I'll teach you how to do that. And of course, it's one of these things that's kind of squishy. You push this little bit over here, and there's an impact somewhere else. So I'll show you, of course, through the course of this to identify the key parameters that shape the quality of the process. And those are the things that we will actually work on. And if you want to understand, just how complicated, all these theories of cause can be, a good book to read is a book called Can't You Hear Them by Simon McCarthy. He describes, I haven't counted, but there must be 50 or 60 different hypotheses as to what sort of causes voices. He describes the pros and cons of each, and it becomes pretty clear if you read his book that there isn't one that stands out above the others as being an obvious leader. The other thing is that we're inclined to, because of this fast forward in our thinking, and we take a stimulus and we assess it in the implications. That's just a process of giving it meaning, because that's what our process typically does. We're taking stimuli. Most of the stimuli we receive are good. We're adding value to them, and that's what gives meaning to them in our lives. Okay, so there's a lot of people out here, especially when we kind of interpret this thing in spiritual terms, that we're kind of saying voices are meaningful and they have meaning, or that they're messengers to other problems. And what I want you to understand is actually that that's just our natural mind process giving meaning to our experiences. In practice, voices have no inherent meaning. Otherwise, they would have the same meaning for all of us. So there's nothing inherent about voices that has any meaning whatsoever. And I'll show you through the course of the videos why that's very, very important. And in fact, quite the opposite. Voices detract from the quality of life. We have overwhelming evidence that voices ruin the quality of life. And that's because they steal mind share and we give them meaning. And that's just our natural process. They steal mind share by arriving in the aware mind, therefore appearing to be significant, because the brain is seeing them as an exception to my filters. It reads it as this crept through my filters, therefore it must be important, therefore I must pay attention to it. And I'm asking questions about it. And I've got all these answers lining up as my brain prefetches some potential kind of answers. And each of those has a string of implications. And I'm experiencing all of those. And that's what's making this thing so extreme. Is this flood of implications, of course, that can sometimes seem pretty awful. And that's why we tend to give meaning to voices. And I will show you that you can disrupt that process quite simply, and simply shift the focus away from voices to the real world, like everybody else does, and actually create good experiences and good outcomes in life. So because of this, we don't know what causes voices, and because we're inclined to give it meaning, voices drag us into the space where belief, hypotheses, and perceptions rule. So because we're focusing at the end of the hockey stick, each of us is kind of looking at the evidence that we have, and of course, we're often not even in a position to step back and look at the bigger picture, and even in the bigger picture, the professionals can't understand it. So for anybody who's actually experiencing this thing, the chances of taking a step back and actually making sense of it are not easy in the moment. It's taken me certainly a very long time, of course, to get there. And of course, the other thing is about this is that the most fundamental thing about this thing about beliefs, hypotheses, and perceptions is that I hear them and you don't. When I say you, I'm hoping if you're watching this thing you do, but others around you don't. And that sets up a basic difference in our experiences. So I'm aware of them, I'm aware of their presence, and I account for that presence by forming a belief about what they are, and I locate that belief about what they are somewhere. It's either in my brain, it's something that's misfiring in my brain, it's in my history, something has happened to me, it's in the world, or I think it's that one, or it's the Russian army or the CIA, or in another world, it's a demon, a spirit, God, the devil. Okay, so we simply locate it, but where we locate it matters, because it changes how we see ourselves and it changes how we see our opportunities in our world. So those two key points I mentioned on the story are influenced in very predictable ways by where we locate voices. And of course, I'm experiencing these things as mostly as interfering, sometimes as sort of encouraging. So I'm forming beliefs about it based on the evidence I have of the experience. The others are forming beliefs about it based on professional opinions, or perhaps cultural interpretations. And of course, those tend to be in conflict with my experience of it. And of course, that difference in beliefs, because beliefs rule, and we each hold our beliefs very, very strongly based on limited evidence. That's the point about beliefs. We form beliefs where we don't have good evidence. It creates conflict between our beliefs, and of course, we hold them strongly. So this is one of the other reasons it's very sort of confusing. And the basic models are really, the kind of illness model. So something is wrong with me, or something is wrong with my brain. And of course, chemical imbalance was the popular theory in psychiatry that's been very steadily discredited, although it's still actively prescribed. It's still actively used as the standard treatment. Is prescribing medication that supposedly fixes a chemical imbalance, when in fact all it does is create a chemical imbalance and destabilize that process. And of course, the whole idea was that by defining it as a physical illness, people thought it would be less stigmatizing, but in fact that hasn't worked at all. Quite the opposite effect. It's been more stigmatizing. But the other important thing about this is you get told you have a chemical imbalance in the brain, that's creating all these things. And typically psychiatrists are often saying you'll never work again. They don't actually give you anything to do about it. So to take this tablet, which dulls your emotions at best, and that's about all that it does. It doesn't give you any sense of control at all. The other big group is the peer group. So that's the dominant kind of professional group with psychiatry. The other big group is the hearing voices movement, or the hearing voices kind of network, which follow the kind of model that says, well, something happened to me, that there are psychosocial causes, even though we don't know what the cause is. These are just inferences made from our history. There are two big groups within the kind of hearing voices movement. The one is people who've had past abuse. So somebody in their life has actively harmed them, bullied them, because voices are bullying. There's a pattern match, and people are kind of easily accept the idea that that earlier bullying is creating this experience because the experiences are similar. The other group that's fairly big is people who've been neglected, in their past, particularly as young, so they kind of feel unloved. And of course, love is what allows us to be who we are. It's that point from which we act. And of course, if we've been sort of unloved and feel underappreciated, of course, we have a diminished view of ourselves. Even though, of course, that's not the experience of people around us. They don't see that at all. They don't have that history. But nevertheless, we project that lack of confidence in ourselves, of course, to the world around us. And of course, there's people in here who will actually not only say not only have I been unloved by my family, but there's a variation of it that says we live in an uncaring society, and that this madness is not an unreasonable response to it. And of course, that's just hypothesis. We don't know, as I say, what causes voices. The other big group is kind of spiritual interpretations, where we're locating this thing in an other world. So this, to say, was me in my brain. This was me in my world, in my history, or in their world, if I'm saying it's an uncaring society. Spiritual interpretations are otherworldly. So we're saying, it's an interaction with some other phenomenon in which good and evil spirits live, and that a shaman will get the good from the good spirits and ward off the bad spirits, basically, more or less, based on rituals and essentially appeasing the spirits. Okay, I'm not a fan of that. And of course, the revealed religions are in fact exactly the same thing. It's just that the spirits have been named and have made specific claims. So there's God, the devil, angels, demons. Basically, same thing, just exaggerated perceptions. This one's creating bigger extremes because God and the devil are supposedly more powerful than your average demon and angel, basically. But they're just models of the same problem of creating two extremes, opposite ends of a spectrum, in conflict with each other, plonking you in the middle. And of course, that's what confuses your process, because you've now got both, and obviously you want one and not the other, but the evil one is present and forcing you to account for it and forcing you to include it in your interpretations. And of course, that's in conflict with your whole process, which is trying to add value. And then, of course, there are other ideas out there that simply say, actually, none of this really matters. What we can do is we can create the conditions that help people to be successful. So the early intervention programs are simply saying, actually, the best benefit is by, they might not use this language, but what they're doing is they're creating a context in which people can perform, and their reward progression is rewarded and appreciated. And of course, that writes the process. So they do that through a combination of education and jobs. So making it easier for people to find jobs, and then of course open dialogue, which is a very interesting approach, but very expensive, unfortunately. Of creating a very, very strong support system around a person, and kind of minimizing the consequences of an extreme state. And I'll show you actually how to do that in one of the tools. And the other thing I should mention here that I haven't actually listed is CBTP. So that's cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis. So it's available in some parts of the world depending on where you are in the world, in a limited fashion. It's grown up in the UK, and it's kind of spreading from there, sort of through Europe. You get some of it in the States. Where I am in South Africa right now, you don't really see it at all. So it's just a modified version of CBT, but what it's doing is, again, is offering one way of helping people analyze their history primarily and their responses to these stimuli. Not teaching them to manage the process, although it's kind of getting, it's sort of getting there. It has advantages and disadvantages, but the key thing is it's not particularly available. And then the process is very, very complicated. Because what's happening, of course, is that this process is fast forwarding, and we are assessing the implications in our story. Of course, this thing arrives. It's unusual, and I'm going to talk in particular about two formats in which it's unusual. The one is what we're calling auditory verbal hallucinations, would be the technical term. Hallucination simply means they're stimuli for which there is no apparent source. And I say apparent because we just don't know, what the source is. And of course, if we hear voices, we attach personalities to them, and we create beliefs about what these faces actually are. And then, of course, what this is doing is it tends to be observing. So it's commenting on what we're doing. And of course, by moving backwards and forwards in time, simply by making comments about your history before they started observing you, they appear to know things about you that's personal and private. So of course, the observing, our monitoring system is noticing this and saying, don't like this. Our Sue system is unsatisfied by the idea that this thing knows all about me. So this observing easily becomes knowing, and we don't notice how it's happened because it's automatic, simply because the stimuli have moved back and forth in time. And then, of course, there's for some people this morphs into this, and which is what's called a thought echo, where we're now communicating at the level of thought. Seems a bit like mental telepathy. Big difference is that my thinking now comes into focus. Over here, my actions are in focus, because that's what voices are commenting on. Over here, voices are commenting on my thoughts. My thinking comes into focus, and my thinking actually now has consequences as far as my process is concerned. My process is responding as if I was interacting with another person or entity, a bully in this case, someone that's abusive. And of course, we experience this as much, much more interfering, because as we're trying to find a good response, this thing is interfering with that response. And therefore, particularly as it moves back and forth and arrives at particular times, we experience that as intervening, especially when voices are claiming that this will happen, that won't happen. They then start to talk about our outcomes, which are things in the future. So this is where we get the perception that voices can intervene. So this is what's giving voices power, is that observing, we're interpreting as knowing. This interfering experience, we're projecting into the world as intervening. So if voices know stuff about me and my history, and they will claim my future, and if they're able to intervene, so they're able to act in my world to change my future, of course, that then gives voices much, much more power. And of course, makes the experience much, much more extreme, because I now have no control over this, and something else is claiming to have control over my life, and I'm experiencing it as this combination of observing and interfering, which is very hard to ignore. I can't dismiss it, okay? But what I can dismiss is this knowing and intervening. I can certainly, dismiss this one relatively easily. This one, voices definitely know, what's going on in my head, and they very often appear to know what's going on in someone else's head. But my response is, well, so what? It just doesn't matter. And of course, this one is about perception. So this is what's making it complicated. Is this thing is arriving. It can morph in terms of how it's interacting with us and how it can engage. And the little tactics that are small nuances actually change our experience of it quite dramatically in ways that give voices power that we don't recognize at the time. So when someone, when we're sort of paranoid, and we're talking about, the influence that voices kind of have, people are kind of saying to us, well, that's ridiculous. But actually, they have no they have no understanding of how that has actually happened. And I say it's happening because in this, in these steps through this kind of process, voices they're present, they're persistent, and of course, their presence forces me to account for them. I form a belief about them. This is what they are. And then, of course, because they're interfering and claiming to influence my outcomes, and of course, skewing my perceptions about what those outcomes are or might be, of course, I'm perceiving that they are actually intervening, even if they're not. So if you understand how that's kind of happening, so you can actually learn to disrupt that, that flow. And of course, what happens is in time with this persisting is that your brain adjusts. So this automatic process of creating expectations becomes hypervigilance. So we don't know what to expect, and the way we deal with uncertainty is we're on the lookout for potential problems. So we become hyper aware. So we devote a bigger proportion of our brain power to scanning the environment and actually looking for stimuli that might cause a problem. And of course, our brain has recognized that these stimuli cause a problem. Therefore, we're on the lookout for them. And when they arrive, we don't know what to expect. And of course, we're getting a much, much stronger reaction to them. And of course, that's all trickery. What we can do is when we recognize that this is what is happening, we can actually reduce the hypervigilance. I'll show you how. We can change our expectation. And if we can change those two, then the stimulus has much less power in terms of gaining a reaction, which is the thing that gains attention and fast forwards to implications and interferes through this the process of regulating the flow. So what we're going to do is focus on the presence and the persistence. Sorry, so the hypervigilance is a response to the frequently arriving stimuli. So this kind of presence, their absence, which leads us to anticipate them. Their invasiveness, the power with which they engage our system and produce a reaction. Their variety, which keeps getting our attention, if it's over here and then over there, and then loud, soft. These are the things that we tune into because because it's something new, feels different. All we have to do is change, say, direction, tonality, tempo. Any of those things will get our attention. But all of that is about finding a way to feed the content into our focus. So what we're going to do, is simplify this by focusing on these 4 points, in the process. The same 4 points in our story, whereas 3 maps to 5, which is our self-confidence. 6, is about how we're perceiving the world. So that's our perception of the world that we live in. 2 is the bit that relates to mindshare. So this is the stuff that's arrived that I'm saying I'm going to spend some effort on working it to achieve a good outcome. So this is what's mindshare. And of course, this is what's programming the mind, is the stuff I focus on. And then, of course, reward, which is the good stimuli. So when we're out there acting, what we're looking for, of course, is good stimuli in our outcomes that are appreciated by others, that actually stimulate our reward system by matching an expectation now that we created earlier. That's the reward progression. So we're closing this loop and saying we shaped what an outcome might look like, and when we got there, it matched expectation. Of course, that's producing a good signal as well. So to simplify all of this, as you can imagine, this is very, very complicated. I have no idea what voices are going to throw at me at any point in time. I don't know when they're going to be there, how powerful they're going to be in their invasiveness, what variety they're going to throw at me, what they're going to say, what scenes they're going to set, what stories they're going to throw at me, how they're going to engage me in this battle between good and evil, whether they're going to say that this outcome is not realistic or whatever, which will change my kind of perceptions of it. I can't forecast all of those things. What I can do is I can say, I know you're there and I don't like it. And I know that you're persistent and I don't like it. And I can actually deal with those two things by simply recognizing that actually the one is just forcing me to account for it. I'm forming a belief. And the other one, this persistence, is actually shaping my perceptions all the time. Positively by encouragement, negatively by discouragement. And all it's doing is creating a big gap, and a change in direction then collapses that thing. So I go from encouragement, a big positive, perception is better than expectations, suddenly start discouraging me, and bang, that drops. And of course, my perception is less than expected. And that's what's causing these swings and extremes. And I can simply say, okay, now that I see that, I can manage it. It's actually quite simple. You're just provoking me. And I can use that to develop my creativity, actually, is how I'll teach you, to use it. So all that complication over here, this is the wedge at the end of the hockey stick. I'm saying you can come right up here to the handle of the hockey stick and saying, hang on, I'm going to take control of that hockey stick. I'm going to manage presence and persistence, and I'm going to do it systematically. So the other part of the complication is that there's a predictable kind of path. Once this stimulus arrives, it's these weird stimuli. They introduce all these new conflicts. So while I'm trying to get on with my life, to take care of myself, to feel safe and secure, to have fun, to pursue my dreams, those 4 kind of steps, in the process, I'm forced to deal with the conflict that voices introduce. It's this confusion which distorts my perception of what's going on in the world. Normally, things will be much clearer. It's this, interference in my experience. So as I'm trying to think things through, voices are interjecting and kind of getting in the way. That's creating this question-answer session is the actual experience of it, because I'm assessing the implications all the time, or my process of input to outcome is not working as it should. That's the experience of interfering. And then, of course, this intervening. So voices are typically doing this by making promises and threats. So the encouragement goes with a promise that says, this will happen, this will happen. Often it's, if you do this, this will happen. And or the flip side is the threat. This won't happen, or if you do this, that will happen, where it's something kind of unpleasant. So this is the conflict with voices. Of course, then there's conflicts in help seeking, because beliefs dominate, and because I'm seen as confused and scared, the beliefs of others dominate. And actually, they know nothing about this experience. They can't understand it, partly because they don't experience it, and I'm struggling to explain it to them, so they struggle to relate to it. So of course, they're managing something completely different. They're trying to perhaps make you feel better. They're trying to make you feel safe, maybe. But actually, they're also trying to get on with their lives, and of course, manage the problem. And in that process, the beliefs of others dominate, and it actually makes the experience worse, because the ones you're looking for help from actually don't know how to deal with it. So that creates new conflicts. And then, of course, the mere fact that I've got this thing going on that is unusual and others perceive as a problem, they stigmatize it, they see me as dangerous or as unstable or moody or whatever. It creates problems in the context that I live in. And of course, my reaction and response to that changes as well. And of course, I create new programs, and none of this is actually healthy stuff. And I'm simply saying you can go way back here. Instead of worrying about all these conflicts, you can go over here and you can manage the phenomenon. So what's causing the complication? All of these complications. So we've had the scariness, the confusion, and the complication, spilling over into life. And it's because this thing is full of surprises. There is no pattern. Well, there is a pattern actually to this stuff. You just don't see it at the time. It's only after a while, that you kind of recognize that actually, for example, I'm forming beliefs about what this phenomenon is, what's sitting at the other end of this handle in the jack in the box and turning it. And initially, I thought it was the neighbors because I heard these voices at a distance. Later on, when I pushed back, voices actually claimed then to be people who had died, people that I know that had died, specific people in my family that had died, then God, then the devil, then an evil God, then aliens, then multiples. And I'm simply saying that was a progression that was the way voices led my beliefs along in order to sustain power and maximize their power. So obviously, as an evil God, had maximum power and maximum claim of ability to intervene, and of course, evil intent in intervening. And of course, that creates the most extreme experiences. But even in the context of God, they also then declared me to be the second coming. And of course, that sounds kind of interesting and fun. What it's doing is, remember, my phenomenology is thought echo, so my thoughts have consequences. And in making me the second coming, then I had thought they had a right to comment on how I perform as the second coming. And every thought had consequences. So even though this was God, supposedly the good guy, there was nothing good about him at all, simply by changing the expectations they had on me, by placing a heavy responsibility on me, where my thoughts had consequences, not just for me, but for all of us, they still managed to create an extreme experience, of course. And this is the point, is voices will have it either way. So whether they're encouraging you as the second coming, or discouraging you as an evil God, and you're the second coming or not, depending on where I was at any particular point in time, they're still able to create extremes, because simply they've created this space where actually all of that's bullshit, but if you believe it, it's not bullshit. And of course, that's the key point. You can simply say it is bullshit. And then, of course, you react to it completely differently. But if you believe it, it makes for a very, very intense experience. And I'll show you how you can actually choose your beliefs, because that's all they are. They're not truths at all. But I say this thing is full of surprises. I had no idea that they would lead me along that path of escalating their power by leading my belief about what they are progressively up this kind of series of steps that gave them more power. Of course, that process from neighbors to God took, I don't know, 9 months maybe or something. I just don't know how long, but it was several. It was certainly quite a while. But I couldn't anticipate that in the beginning. I was just experiencing each belief at the time, and of course voices would keep that going and sustain it for a while until it sort of started to lose effectiveness, and then they'd try something else, and then they'd try something else. And of course, because I was completely rejecting them all the time, they just kept trying new avenues. And of course, you would expect your voices to do this as well. And the point to do is to laugh at it, because actually it becomes silly when you see it. When you see that kind of pattern, it becomes ridiculous. So it's full of surprises in the sense that it's weird, so it's getting attention. It's extreme, so this constant kind of escalation. It behaves unpredictably, which keeps our monitoring system off balance. It behaves strategically. This escalation, I didn't know that was going to happen. And of course, they engaged me in the story between good and evil. I have a role. I'm the second coming. Voices were at one point good, at another point evil, and then of course both, and I'm caught in the middle, and I can't act in their world. All I can do is argue with them, and of course try and bring them together onto the same page. And of course, all they do is refuse to be on the same page, and there's nothing I can do. And I'm caught in the middle, in the middle of this conflict. And whilst I, supposedly had this role in solving, this problem of the conflict between good and evil in that world, of course, which has implications for this world. It gives them lots of room to play strategy games, which are ways of creating surprise, really, and of confusing my drive system, because they just kept changing the rules, changing the game, creating a new playing field, a new scenario, in which my brain was fast forwarding to assess implications to create all these horrible experiences and kind of episodes. And more than that, they behave cruelly. I mean, unbelievably cruel. Torture, they are the most miserable mother frickin' things you have ever come across. And of course, when we tell you that, or tell others that, they don't believe us, because their beliefs about this spiritual world are about love. And yet this thing is behaving incredibly badly. And in fact, its most incredibly bad behavior was creating beliefs in the form of the revealed religions, many of them in conflict with each other. The same thing, just creating conflict. And of course, the point is, nobody will believe that. because they haven't experienced it, but you're caught in the middle of it, of experienced it. So imagine you're in a tribe somewhere where you've got a shaman, who has this role of interceding on behalf of good and evil spirits, so warding off the evil spirits, asking for the favors of good spirits through rituals to bring about good things for the tribe or for individuals. So here in South Africa, people will go and see a traditional healer, to get advice on love, on money, on the size of their penis, on the outcome of a court case, on all of these things, and they will perform rituals and pay money. You can even cast spells on an enemy. So whilst, a lot of us kind of think, okay, you can look at this kind of thing and say, we're all potential shamans and what have you. For the poor person who believes they've had an evil spell cast on them by some other enemy, of course, that just makes the experience way more intense. So we have to look at those things kind of in the bigger picture. The cultural beliefs are actually not helping us either. For people in the experience, it's actually making it much worse. And of course, there are 20 hours of video showing you how, because lots of us will have different experiences, and the idea is to give people many points of access from which to recognize that experience. So understanding that this whole thing is scary, confusing, and adds complication to life, and is complicated in particular ways, and recognizing that actually you can simplify it by focusing at the beginning of the process rather than the end. Okay, let's ask the question from a process point of view, rather than from a psychoanalysis point of view. What can we do to cut through that complexity and confusion and create good experiences in the mind? Those 4 maps through the 4 points along the emotional systems, because that's where our emotions are the product of that difference between perception and expectation. So if we can manage that, we can create good emotions equals good energy. And good energy translates to good flow from one step to the next. So the handoff of the information to the next system goes in the direction that we expect, which is stimulus to outcome. That's what creating good experiences is about, is managing that flow. And of course, if you do that, you achieve desirable outcomes in life. So you can also then focus on, when you're focusing on the story rather than focusing on the implications that voices have pushed through by simply injecting something into the one end of the process, we're fast forwarding these implications. We can simply say, no voices, not that, this. I'm going to focus on creating this story. And actually in that context, this that you're throwing at me is completely irrelevant. So what can we do to do all of this? We can, these are the 6 tools. I say there are, we can actually learn to manage the process. We can actually make that very, very simple. So what I'm going to do is take you through how each of these tools work through this app, and encourage you to make habits of applying them. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to learn to manage voices, and you're going to do 2 things. One is you're going to manage the relationship with voices so that you're creating good expectations because you're in control of them. And you're going to do this by making caricatures of your voices. So this is because voices are not what they claim to be. They're not what I interpret them as, and they're not what they claim to be. They're not the neighbors, people that have died, my ancestors, God, the devil, aliens, multiples. They can't be all of those things. I simply say you're none of them. You'll be what I tell you you are. And this is the mold I'm casting you in. I'm making a caricature of you, something ridiculous rather than something powerful. So rather than an evil God that's intervening, you're Poopsie, Tutu, or Squealy. Those are the names of the 3 voices that I hear. And new rules. I live by these principles, and I'm going to respond to you on the basis of these principles. I'm not going to compromise. Principles I live by. I'm not going to appease you, voices. I'm going to change how I react by setting the principles by which I react to you. Okay, so you can actually completely change the nature of your reaction simply by changing the information you use, your frame of reference from which you react. And you can do those in one exercise because it's about literally saying to voices, look, this is how things are going to work from now on. Okay, pretty much the approach. Then what you're going to do, and you're going to name the voices. Then what you're going to do is, and you give them a silly name. So as I said, I had Tutu, Poopsie, and Squealy based, and we'll go through those later. Then what you're going to do is when voices actually start talking, what they're doing, when they're throwing a stimulus at you, of course, that's what's producing the reaction. So what you're going to do is interrupt it. So rather than let the reaction flow through to a response and an outcome and this assessment of implications, you can say, no, Tutu. The moment Tutu starts to speak, or actually any voice, I just pick one and speak to one at a time. Make it easy. This is the point. You want a quick automatic response. So you have a silly name and you say, Tutu, no, I don't think so. And that's you interrupting this process, and then you replace the rest of it. So having interrupted it, you simply say, okay, I'm not reacting to that. I'm going to say, this outcome is a good one for me. So I'm going to go from where I am to there. And all I'm going to do in that process typically is create good energy. At first, that's the place to start. That then gives you the sense of control, and then later on we'll worry about creating a good story, because that's what you want to then do, is project that into your story. So this is the tool that you use all the time that becomes a habit. Defining the relationship is a once-off kind of exercise. It's fun. You create a picture of your voices as a sort of caricature. You define them in your own mold, and you then say, you give them a name. And the name gives you a way to interrupt immediately, always, and you just practice. It just becomes a habit, and then you gain control of your response. Once you've got control, you then start to have fun and you play with it, because what you want to do is create good energy. So this is the new habit you want to create, and it has application in creating new habits in the rest of your life as well. So it's not just about voices. You can use the same process to change any of your programs and habits. What you want to do is make this easier, because your voices are going to react and respond. They're going to change their strategy. They're going to bother you at different times about different things. They're going to create new themes. And you're going to say, okay, voices, it doesn't matter what you throw at me, I'll be ready for you. I know how to control my emotions through breathing. So breathing offers you the quickest way to access your emotions. You can change your state of body and mind simply by breathing deliberately. So you don't have to. You can meditate as a habit, as one way of doing it. But in fact, the easiest way is to pick one of the heart rate variability apps or breathing rhythms, and it's typically you use breathing exercises for 3 or 4 minutes every day to form a habit of knowing that you can control your emotions using your breathing. And actually, by making it a habit and practicing it, for a period, it doesn't take very long. Over 2 or 3 weeks, you will notice you actually change your breathing habitually. And of course, what that does is it literally changes your physical state. It changes how you feed both oxygen and carbon dioxide to the brain, and you can actually make your reactions less sensitive in general. And of course, it's important to do, because what happens when voices are throwing all the stuff at you all the time, that hypervigilance also translates to chronic stress. And what you're doing is you're eliminating that chronic stress as the long-term thing. So you're creating good conditions. And number 2, you have a tool that you can use to intervene in your emotions. And what's important about your emotions is they're calling up particular information and paths of information that cast forward. So if voices throw a threat at you, you're seeing threat paths and reactions and responses. If you can breathe and change that and say, okay, that's not so scary as I thought, let's look for something else, you see different paths of action. And you can literally use your breathing to change the information that you see. Okay, I mean, that's what you're doing is changing the information that's in focus here. The other thing you can do is, because voices are commenting all the time on what's happening tomorrow, this afternoon, next week, or what someone else is thinking, you can actually pay through events in advance. Typically, we only have a couple of things in our day that might be important, and I take a few minutes in the shower every day, and I say to my voices, oh, Poopsie or Tutu, whoever I'm speaking to on that day, this is what's going on in my day today. This is why it will work well. I'm prepared. This is what I expect. And actually, if it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. And all I'm doing there is I'm narrowing the band of possible outcomes to what's realistic, instead of letting voices pick something up here or something down here that shapes my perceptions, and therefore my attitude when I go in. I'm saying I'm in control of that, so I can actually scope the outcomes. And of course, improve my chances for success at the same time. And of course, these are the things that build my story over time. I can manage the risk. As I mentioned here, voices are going to react. They're going to throw something at you that's going to be a surprise and may well create an extreme state. And I'm going to say to them, so what, voices? If that should happen, I have a plan. And not only that, I have coached people around me to help me through it. So even though I may be in a bad state, I can call somebody and they can help me through it because I will have told them how, I will have told them what I need, we will have agreed it, we'll know what the plan is, the information will be in my mind. So even though you scare me, I've now got a plan coming up in the information that I see because I've put it there in this context. So my brain will now be calling up the emergency plan. I'm going to call this friend. I'm going to ask him this for this help. And da, da, da. So we're just going to take the risk out of an extreme state. Simply having a plan is often enough. And then once you've got confidence kind of in all of this, we're going to repair the harm that's happened through the period of hearing voices. So I developed sensitivities to all sorts of themes in which voices were very, very busy. That's the best way to identify them. Where a voice is busy. And in fact, for me, they related to my goals. So they were getting in the way of me creating the kind of story that I wanted, or certainly making it much more stressful getting there. And once I mapped them, I simply used a technique from my consulting days where you're just mapping a problem. I used a fishbone diagram. It's a nice way to do it. You just use the skeleton of a fish. The head represents your goal. The little ribs that point off are just the factors that will help you achieve the goal. And you'll see then where voices are busy in the context of that goal. There'll be things that improve your chances of achieving that goal. And this is where voices will be busy. And of course, you're not always connecting those two. And the fishbone just helps you connect them. And you'll see, okay, that's happening and it's interfering with this. And I'm not realizing that. Now that I see it, it's far less kind of stressful. And of course, what I'm doing then is I'm calling out the strategy that voices are actually are throwing at me. So those are the 6 tools, and they actually map to the managing the process. All you're doing with all of those, in its simplest terms, is you are managing the information that is in focus. So the information that is in your process that you're very aware of, as it sort of flows, as it flows through the process. I say it starts by creating new rules and a caricature. And I say you do those together because what you're doing is you're defining the relationship with voices. You're saying you're not who you say you are, you're who I say you are, and these are the rules by which we will play. You don't give voices an option. It's not a negotiation. It's an assertion of your rights. Okay. So this is Tutu. She was the one who attacked my drive system all the time. She had this. She's got a spanner in a toolbox because she was always around trying to fix my life, always commenting on outcomes. This will work, that won't work, this won't happen, that email's not going anywhere, all of that kind of stuff. And of course, all of that stuff was happening magically because they had the ability to intervene, which I don't buy. So in fact, I broke her wand, and there's a story behind the pink and the look and what have you, but we'll get to that in when we're actually dealing with them. But the point is, make them ridiculous or exaggerate their worst characteristics. So their worst characteristics was actually this idea that they could influence my life and intervene and create outcomes for me, that weren't on my agenda for outcomes that I was trying to achieve. So this breaking the wand, was actually the biggest thing, in this particular thing. Secondly, so I do this once basically for each voice. One set of rules for all of them. Name them. This is Tutu. So gives you a way to interrupt them. So the moment they speak, I say, Tutu, not that. So in fact, I do this, rather than responding to them individually, I say, okay, I'm only talking to Tutu this week or this year. In fact, I've done it typically for a year at a time. The moment they say something, I say, Tutu, really, we're not doing that. Or Tutu, really, great, that's great. Let's work with that. But what we're going to do with it is, so what I'm doing is, the interrupt is just slowing the process down. So I'm cutting off that fast forward to implications, and I'm saying, actually, what you're there, I've heard it, it's caused a reaction, so what? I'm going to replace the flow from here on. I'm going to pick something that amuses me, or I'm going to say, actually, PPI, you're just bothering me today. Look at these marvelous people around me today. I'm going to just bring my attention to what's going on around me. Because stimuli from the world around me are much, much more reliable, and they reinforce the process naturally. So you'll get, we'll talk more about this in kind of other exercises, but all I'm doing is I'm just interrupting to take control of the flow. So over here, I'm changing expectations, which is minimizing my reaction. When voices say something, I'm strengthening my reaction to say, nope, that's my interrupt. Don't like that part of, what follows from that. I'm going to own what follows. So I'm owning the interaction, and I'm going to do this in a way that creates good energy and then good story. Okay, I'll move from one to the other. And I'm going to manage some of the risks. So the voices are often commenting on what's going to happen. And I will actually use that to say, gosh, Tutu, that's an interesting thing to think about right now. But actually, what's going to happen is this person will respond this way. Or actually, I don't know how that person is going to respond, but that's what's going to make it interesting. And I'll say, well, actually, this is why the event will work out the way that it should. And I'm prepared for that. And the risks are this, not what you say, but this. And if that happens, I have a plan for that too. So all I'm doing is I'm kind of minimizing the risks that voices throw at me in my life. So so this is making me feel stronger. I'm not what voices say I am. This is creating a good experience, so I'm in control. This is voices commenting on my world, and I'm saying, no, not that way. I have a better view of what's happening in my world than you do. I can actually gain better control of this process by breathing habitually in a different way, and knowing that I can actually intervene and slow the process down and change the information that's prefetched ahead of me by sort of forward thinking. I can actually map the themes that produce the strongest reaction, and I can gradually work on them. In this process, I can just use some basic exposure therapy ideas to kind of say, okay, I'm going to address this now because I'm feeling strong. So I'll choose the time at which I'm going to address it in my interaction with voices. So when they're provoking me and making threats about it, I use that to move towards it rather than away from it. I say, Tutu, really? Come on. You're going to do that? Well, then do it now. What are you waiting for? Okay. And what you're doing is you're removing your sensitivity to it by making it ridiculous. So those are the basic ideas. New rules, caricatures, one exercise, interrupt, replace, mindfulness, breathe to own to stabilize the process physically, play through events, and minimize sensitivity to bring the right sort of information into focus. So these are the 6 tools that we're going to talk about. You can read more about similar. Oh, sorry, I'm missing one. The emergency plan. So if things go wrong, if this doesn't work, what's the worst that can happen? I'm going to take 2 days off with tranquilizers. Somebody's going to bring me chicken soup. Anything that's urgent, that's in my diary, somebody else will handle, and we'll make it a non-event. Rather than this means hospital for 6 weeks or something like that. We just minimize the consequences by having a plan. And you can read more about these ideas. They're not obviously they're ideas that are tools that I've come up with based on my application of neurolinguistic programming to understand the process and kind of managing it. There is support for some of the concepts in here in some of the existing research. So in terms of managing voices, there are 2 studies, both from King's College in London. The one is avatar therapy. The other one is slow-mo. Avatar therapy helps people create avatars of their voices. So they actually they create a picture of what they think their voices actually look like, and of course they then coach people to face up to voices in their bullying. And I'm simply saying what you want to do is actually learn to do this yourself anyway. And actually you can do it quite simply. You don't need to build an avatar. A caricature actually works better because you're minimizing the power that voices claim. At the same time, you name them, which of course changes what you believe about them, what they claim. You're removing their power, much, much more kind of systematically. And of course, the name is also giving you a way to interrupt them, which is really what slow-mo is about. Slow-mo is the therapy, again, from King's College that encourages people to slow the process down and think about alternative interpretations. I'm actually saying you don't need to bother to interpret what voices are saying. You simply need to interrupt the process, because when you see all that complication, and you never know what voices are going to throw at you, don't waste your time figuring out what it's going to mean. Just make it interesting, make it fun. And make sure that actually your real world stimuli and your real world story are the things that are more significant than voices. You change the pecking order. So your voices can still be there, you can still play with them and have fun, because they're persistent, so you want to create good energy in it, but what you want to do is diminish their significance. And you do that by simply saying, no, I'm not actually accepting your interpretation, I'm going with mine. And of course, then this whole idea of creating the conditions for success. so the breathing is founded in the ideas about heart rate variability. You can read all about that. There are apps that help you manage your heart rate variability very specifically, one form of breathing exercise. The other thing is actually neurolinguistic programming. The 6 tools that I've spoken about are a very small piece of what NLP does. I call these kind of neurobics for the mind, because you're helping you, they're exercises that help you gain control of the process. And in terms of repairing the harm using some kind of exposure therapy, there's a good study called drug-free after basal exposure therapy out of Norway that supports the kind of principles, and you'll see more about that that later on. So that's a rather long overview. It was a bit longer than I anticipated, but that's really how this app is intended to work: is that you apply these 6 tools, make them habits, and you'll control your experience and prevent the recurrence of psychosis. So thanks for engaging with this app. If you want to comment about it on social media, please use the hashtag made sense.